At the end of last week's video, I mentioned that one of the factors that may have contributed to President Duterte's win in 2016 was the Manila centrism that has been dominating Philippine politics over the past century, especially Philippine national politics. And so in this video, I want to go into it a little bit more and just give my thoughts on the whole thing and think more generally aloud about the 2016 presidential election. I think it's important for us to reflect a little bit more so that we can be in a better place when we think about the upcoming election cycle for next year's election. Manila centrism has been a problem in Philippine society for as long as it can, as long as we've had since the beginning of American colonization. And as everyone knows, during Spanish colonization, there were sections of Mindanao or Maguindanao that was not really fully colonized. And when it transitioned from Spanish colonization to American colonization, that was really the time when the Moro province where Maguindanao became more colonized. And during this period of time, people, in case you may not know, they were actually ruled separately from the rest of the Philippines. So the Philippines is ruled by the American government, but the Moro province in the south was actually ruled by the American military under martial law. And it was ruled in a way that made it self-sufficient and not have to rely on the rest of the Philippines. So the rest of Visayas and Luzon, it was only really self-sufficient. It had its own economy. They traded with other countries on their own, and they just had like their own little world. And in this period of time, supposedly this is when they actually developed more of their Moro identity. The Moro identity was something that was recommended by the American military officials in order to help them have something to unite them as a nation. Because because of the Moro province at the time had come from like various discord and rebellion and all this stuff, and so the Americans supposedly wanted the people to have something in common so that they'll be easier to rule, and so they helped develop this thing called the Moro identity and all this stuff, and had them kind of become more religious and have a more of a stronger sense of identity that maybe they didn't really have prior, because they were all also just separate. They were kind of separate tribes, like the rest of the Philippines, and because they were never really, they never had a chance to unify within each other. Religion was used as a way to unify them, so that again they'd be easier to rule. And it was in this crucial period of time that the distinction of the Maguindanaoans and the rest of the Philippines was most clearly established. One of the interesting things about Philippine history is that when you learn more about it, you realize so much of our national politics is influenced or directly influenced by American politics. So an example is during the 1910s, the government from the United States went from a Republican government to a Democratic government. And one of the things that was being pushed was to help transition the Philippines towards independence. And so, this push was by people like Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña, who were lobbying in Washington for us to have independence as soon as possible. And one of the ways that they were able to kind of think this through is to push for this thing called Philippinization. I think it may have been under Woodrow Wilson, but I'm not totally sure. Maybe, my memory may be mistaken. But there's this thing called Philippinization where they wanted to have more and more of the government be run by Filipinos. And one of the kind of side effects of this Philippinization movement under Woodrow Wilson is that the Moro province got dissolved. And they had this thing, we have to kind of create a political system that encompassed the whole of the Philippines. And, the Moro province was not a part of that idea. So the Moro province got dissolved and it became one complete Philippines that where the main government was in Manila. So there's a transition from, in Moro province, there were these local leaders who were able to kind of have control over the government, and suddenly they had to listen, or their power was subsumed now by Manila. And they had to reorient themselves and restructure how they conducted politics by learning the ropes of Manila politics. They had to kind of learn who the people in Manila that were important. They had to kind of learn how to speak, the language of Manila politics, and learn about which politicians they had to kind of appease in order to maintain power wherever they were. And I'm sure this was a problem in many parts of the country, but it's especially a problem in what used to be the Moro province in Mindanao. A lot of this can be learned in this book called Making Mindanao by Patricia Abenales. I highly recommend it. It came out in 2000, and there was a reissue last year for their 20th anniversary edition. Really interesting book. And so during this period of Filipinization, one of the interesting ideas that were coming out of Mindanao was the sense that some of them felt like they were being colonized by the North. They're colonized by Manila, where one time they had, they could exercise control over themselves, and now all of their control had to go through Manila. All their funds, all the taxes, everything had to go through Manila. And there was a bit of a discord, a bit of a tension because of this thing, but they really had to accept it, because if they didn't accept it, they wouldn't be able to. The people who wanted to have power wouldn't be able to kind of control and have, continue to hold this power. Usually these were like the old political families in Mindanao and Maguindanao. So this was what happened. And so the tension of like having to appease Manila and having to, reorient one's thinking about politics as a way to kind of, I guess, kiss up to whoever is going to be in Manila running as president was a big part of politics around the country. So this is part of the reason why it was quite a big deal when President Duterte, when Duterte was someone who became president, because he was the first person from Mindanao who became the Philippine president, and that was a big deal at the time. Perhaps because of a combination of many different things, but you can even argue that Duterte is not really from Mindanao. He's from Visayas. I think he's from Southern Leyte or something like that. I think his dad was mayor of a city called Danao in Cebu, and then he went to Davao and became the governor of Davao. This is before Duterte became mayor of Davao. But he spent a lot of his political career in Davao, lived there for a long time, and so it was a big deal when he was a possible candidate for presidency, because he, at the time, for people who lived in Mindanao or from other parts of the country who never felt represented by someone, he was there to kind of fill in that gap. He was someone who had like a viable path to presidency. He had a decent, he had like a perceived good track record because of how he was handling Davao. And this idea that he was an outsider, political outsider, helped him really get some support from other people. And, in this idea of him being a political outsider, people can maybe contest. They could say, well, actually, he was like he has like a family dynasty in Davao and all this stuff. But at the time when he was running, this was not something that people were really talking about or thinking about. And I think what was central to the idea was that he was not part of the same Manila elites that have been running the country for the past 100 years. One of the things that we can look to, for example, is that in Philippine society, Philippine history, before Cory Aquino, from martial law, so from the beginning of Philippine independence to martial law, there have only really been two major parties. There were the Nacionalista Party and the Liberal Party, where every 4 years, every 6 years, or whenever the cycle was, it changed a bit. But whenever there was a new presidential cycle, the winners always took turns. Nationalista, Liberal, Nationalista, Liberal, Nationalista, Liberal. Like if you look back on it, like Philippine presidents, you can see Manuel Quezon, Nationalista, Osmeña, Nationalista, Manuel Rojas, Nationalista, then he started the Liberal Party. Quirino, Liberal, Magsaysay, Nationalista, Garcia, Nationalista, Tristado Macapagal, Liberal, Marcos, Nationalista. And then after Cory became president, in the next cycle, it kind of broke down further, because what used to be, there were only two parties, Nationalista and Liberal. In the 1992 elections with Ramos, I think there were maybe 7 big presidential candidates, which really split the vote very broadly, where I think Ramos only had around 23% of the vote, so less than 1/4 of the national vote went to Ramos, and he became the president. So for a long time in Philippine history, there was a monopoly of power with only the Nationalistas and the Liberal Party, and you could only be part of one or the other, and they were backed by what others may describe as like the very rich elites, land-owning elites, or whatever you want to call it. And this was a big part of the political machinery behind the scenes. And so Duterte, when he was running, was part of another party that was not, I think it was the party that didn't have as much funds as the Nationalista or the Liberal Party or the party of Binay. And so he was looked at really as a political outsider. He didn't have as much funding to run his presidential campaign as the others. And there was a sense that his support came from people from like a broader scope of people who normally would not feel represented by by national politics, or who have been maybe so disillusioned by the different promises that were given by every government, and so any kind of sense of an outsider looks to them as someone who is worth giving a shot to. Now, again, a big thorn in all of this is the drug war, which we'll get into maybe in another future video. But that is a big factor. But I will look at it again another time. We don't have time for it right now. But just thinking about the idea of the political outsiders, one can really think about one way to perceive Duterte is through the lens of the so-called populist. So a political populist is someone who is able to gather a lot of support through this idea of creating binary of like the elites, the corrupt elites, and the rest of the people. They purport themselves to be the voice of the people, and they are there to stop the rule of the elites and finally kind of enact what the people actually want after a long period of just elites passing power to each other. And this was a message that resonated quite deeply in the Philippines, and in a more broader global sense, it's a message that has really taken many countries. There are populists in so many countries, from the United States to many different Latin American countries to Europe. Many politicians who, when you see it over and over again, it ends up kind of just becoming like, it's like almost like a script of sorts, like a populist script, where they all share this idea of like they're elites in power, and we need to kind of the people are not being represented properly, and therefore we need to kind of take power and perhaps even change the structure in which the system is in place, in order to make things more amenable to kind of following the voice of the people. And this is an interesting idea that it's very useful, I think, to think about in a more broader sense, because again, it's happened all over the world. That thing I mentioned can in everything from like in France to like Le Pen to Donald Trump in the United States, or even Bernie Sanders to some degree, where Duterte was in that same mold of like there's a populist who also one of the things that the populists do is that they talk in a way that is closer to the voice of the people than the so-called liberal elites. And again, as much as this sounds like I'm talking specifically about Duterte, it really is something that's been happening all around the world in different governments. I highly recommend reading some books in populism. I read this one really recently called A Very Short Introduction to Populism, which was very useful, I think. But anyway, so one of the weird things about populism is that it's complicated to think of in terms of how democratic it is, or how much its relationship with democracy is kind of complicated, because in a sense, populism, or having a populist presidential candidate, often actually increases voting turnout. It actually increases the participation of the public in the election, because it rallies people who normally maybe would not participate because they feel too disillusioned by the system in place to actually go out and vote. So in a sense, it's kind of more democratic because more people are voting. But at the same time, it can very easily lead to very many complications, as we've seen from this presidency over the past 6 years. And for example, if you look at Philippine history, the two election cycles with the highest voting turnout, and voting turnout as defined as people who, the number of people who actually voted who were registered. If you can try to guess if you want to think of who were the two highest voting turnout, the two highest voting turnout years is 2016 Duterte and 1998 with President Estrada, ERAP. ERAP actually has the highest voting turnout. That year had the highest voting turnout in Philippine history, as long as we've been measuring voting turnout. Second place is Duterte, and the rest are quite much lower. And so there's a sense where like this populist rhetoric, this kind of having these people who are trying to go against the elites and all this stuff, it's actually very effective, and it actually somehow increases political participation. But at the same time, it creates a lot of these more complicated issues that we'll kind of go into next time. But again, this is just a brief overview of one of the factors that may have contributed to Duterte's presidency, which is the sense that he was a political outsider, and what that actually meant in terms of Philippine history, how that fits into the international politics here in the Philippines. There are other aspects as well that were quite interesting that we can go into next time, such as that Duterte was someone he had many promises. He said he was going to have peace with the communists. He was supposedly friendly with the Communist Party, as well as with the MILF, because he's from Mindanao. So peace with the communists and the more Islamic groups, that was a big part of his presidency that didn't really turn out as he hoped. But yeah.